Thanks for joining us today for The Real Story. Fox News Alert, big news day. Verdict is in. Moments away from hearing the jury's decision in the trial of the Boston Marathon bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Hi, everyone. I'm Gretchen Carlson. It's a big day on The Real Story. Thanks for joining us. The jury reaching that verdict after some 12 hours of deliberations over the past 2 days. Right now, attorneys, survivors, and their families returning to court where they will find out if the jury has decided guilty or not guilty, and if he's convicted, Tsarnaev could face the death penalty. Because I want to bring our legal panel in as we await the jury verdict here. Brian Claypool, defense attorney. So if he's found guilty, Brian, of even just one of these death penalty charges, it goes to the next phase, right?
Absolutely. And I would agree also, Gretchen, that with 95 witnesses and only 11 hours of deliberation, that tells me that this jury was in agreement on nearly every count. And that does not bode well for the defendant.
What do you think, Brian?
Well, I tend to agree with John on this. I think what the jury is struggling with is, can two people really get together and plot out everything? Because these two guys may not have known what was going to happen once the bomb went off. So the jury might be wondering, did they also collaborate with Officer Collier? Did they also collaborate with the Watertown drama as well? So I think that this might suggest a jury might be lenient as to later events that happened.
Okay, so count one and count two, we now know Dzhokhar Tsarnaev has been found guilty of both. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, guilty of at least 2 counts so far. We have 28 left to go. All right. So, Brian, the same jury now going to be deciding this next phase.
Right. And I think what's also important here, Gretchen, is if the jury's answering guilty on the first question, these sub-questions are going to be answered yes as well. There's no way this jury's going to find, yes, he used a pressure cooker, but no, he's not aiding and abetting.
Okay.
So
count 3 now. Sorry to interrupt. Guilty. Possession and use of a firearm. This is again with pressure cooker, bomb number 1, during and in relation to a crime of violence resulting in death, and aiding and abetting. Again, a death penalty charge.
Right. I think what's important here also, Gretchen, is the more charges that he's found guilty of, that might filter into the mind of the jury when they're determining whether to give him death or not.
In what way?
Well, I think if all 17 counts that could lead to death, or he's found guilty on, then I think the jury might be sitting there saying, we've got to send this guy to the death chamber.
During voir dire of these jurors, where both attorneys have the ability to question the jurors about how likely they are to be able to give the death penalty, how important is that in this case? How important was it, Brian?
Well, I'm not sure every juror is going to tell you the truth. They might tell you, yes, of course, I'm willing to give the death penalty, but when that rubber meets the road and you're asked to send somebody to death, I think that's a different story. So I think the prosecution is going to have to deal with that.
Because, Brian, you were saying that's so important. What were you talking about?
The fact that this jury is finding him guilty on conspiracy charges proves that he collaborated with his brother to carry out these heinous acts. And that is going to lead to possibly now, I think, the death penalty. Because now unequivocally the jury said, you knew what you were doing, you participated in this, and you carried it out.
He's now guilty of 9. All of these, we should mention, are all death penalty charges. Some of these charges, I think 17 of the 30 are death penalty charges. So that would mean that 13 are not. But at this point, it's really moot, isn't it?
Right, absolutely. And Gretchen, I think the only hope he has in the death penalty phase is that he did not die in this horrible event that he carried out. In other words, if he was a true terrorist, I would argue, as his lawyer, that he would have allowed himself to die. He wanted to live, and I think his lawyer should argue that maybe that signals that he's not the terrible person that he was. You got to give the prosecution credit, Gretchen. They really did dig deep down, like John has said, and they brought this to each victim, and I think that really is going to really help in the death penalty phase.
All right. In my hand, Jonna and Brian, I have what I assume the jury receives, which is the piece of paper where they mark off whether or not they're guilty or not.
The verdict
Is that
forms.
what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me.
And again, I just want to remind everyone how the massive amount of information that these jurors have had to go through. 92 witnesses for the prosecution, 4 for the defense. But then to go through all of this and all the subsets that we've been describing for the last 20 minutes or so, Brian.
But Gretchen, that proves my point earlier, that look how copious this verdict form is. The fact that the jury only took 11 hours proves that they were all in agreement and they were going to find him guilty on every single count. If I'm his lawyer, I'm worried because I know that she was trying to build her case to not have the death penalty through this case in chief. The fact that you're getting a quick verdict like this and a guilty on every count does not bode well for the death penalty phase.
Okay, possession and use of a firearm, pressure cooker bomb number 2, during and in relation to the crime of violence. A lot of these sound similar, but I think it's because we're talking about 4 people who died, right? And in each case, according to this jury form, they have to mark off that they believe each of those 4 people was killed as a result of this charge.
Right, and I think, Gretchen, the prosecution did a great job of bringing a face and voice to these victims of the Boston attack. They could have just gone through this quickly, but each person killed, they spoke about individually. And I think that hurt the defense. And what they're going to do, Gretchen, is they're going to say, oh, this guy was a good guy up until this happened. He went to school.
He was a kid.
He did community service. And again, remember what I said earlier. I think the fact that he did not commit suicide by cop and allow himself to be killed, I would argue, is he is not a devoted terrorist.
Interesting. You've been talking a lot, Brian, about the fact that you see in him the fact that he didn't kill himself, a different kind of a person, that you don't really see him so much as a terrorist. But it will be interesting to think and know how the jury sees that.
Well, I think that's going to be the challenge for them because the worst thing possible for him happened here. He killed a child. I mean, all murder is reprehensible, obviously, but he killed a child and he killed a police officer. I have a little girl, you have kids, and most people revere police officers except, I mean, with what happened in South Carolina. But, I mean, that's not going to bode well for him. But I do think he's got a good lawyer, and I think what she has to say is, this is a kid that was wavering. He was on the fence. He participated, but if he was truly dedicated to this terroristic cause, he would have walked out in the middle of that street and had himself killed.
Well, I don't know. Right now they're finding him guilty, and now we have 24 and 25 counts also guilty. And Brian, bring us back up to speed now. This is going to happen relatively quickly, right?
Right. I think you're going to have a death penalty phase within a few weeks. And I think the jury in this case will sentence him to death. And here's why I think that. Shauna mentioned earlier that maybe the jury would throw him a bone. Count 21 was the count where they should have thrown him a bone.
Why?
Which is, well, because it's a minor offense. It's relatively a minor offense. Interference with commerce by threats and violence. Now, if that jury had 1 ounce of compassion for him, they would have let him off on that charge. They charged him with that guilty. That is a message to him that we're going to find you or sentence you to death. Here's a couple other quick reasons why. Who's going to come forward at the death penalty phase? Who's going to walk into that courtroom and speak on his behalf?
A psychiatrist will. A psychiatrist will.
Well, we'll see, because they're going to be subject to a lot of scrutiny too. Because the witness has to weigh: am I going to have a career after this or not? Think about that.
That's a good point.
And then the other point I wanted to make real quick, Gretchen, was the fact that this jury, as John has said too, found him guilty on the conspiracy charges and the aiding and abetting. That puts him in bed with his brother, and I think he is going to be sentenced to death.
How does an attorney school their client in a situation like this? I mean, so wouldn't the attorney, if she or he is supposedly doing such a great job in defending the client, wouldn't they advise them as to how their disposition should be in the courtroom, or is that not something that they do?
Well, 2 things. Send me on a saucer to Mars before I ever defend this guy, because he didn't show any emotion in this case. That's the first thing. To answer your question then, Gretchen, this signals to me that maybe the lawyer that's representing him doesn't have good client control, because I'm sure she has spoken to him about his demeanor in the courtroom, and he's not heeding her advice. So that's another bad side.
But doesn't it also show us that he truly is a terrorist? Because terrorists who do this type of thing to anybody, young or old, well, they do it because they're a terrorist, right?
I agree with you, and the jury's looking at that. The jury might not tell you that, but John, I'm sure will agree. They are looking at every move a murder suspect is making in that courtroom. Well, you can tell them to at least look at the jury once in a while, or at least show a little bit of emotion, right?
But the jurors get to go home now, right? Or do they not?
I'm not sure if they're sequestered. I don't think they're sequestered in this case. But rest assured, this judge will give a strong admonition to not, no offense to you, but to not watch the media outlets and not read the newspapers about the case until the death penalty phase. And that's a daunting task for these jurors.
All right. You know, one of the things I'm thinking about, Brian and Jonna, today as I'm watching this is it seems like almost on a daily basis now, domestically here in the United States, we're seeing other arrests of other possible terrorists. Just the other day, just last week, 2 or 3 women, 2 in New York and 1 in Philadelphia, trying to build pressure cookers like these 2 yahoos did, right?
Yep.
So here we have a huge problem, not just legally in our country, but how do we continue to combat this domestic grown terror?
Well, a good answer to that is that's why President Obama should speak about this. He needs to send a message that he's monitoring this, and if anybody does anything like this again, they're going to pay the ultimate price. And looking at this verdict form, Gretchen, I mean, I think everybody in the country should be impressed with our justice system and the amount of work. This was a slam dunk case, but this prosecutor took the time to really work hard on this case, to build it up, to spend the time on this verdict form.
It's a model. It's a model for future terrorists, because this goes to show that when you charge like this, when you charge conspiracy, when you charge aiding and abetting, you do it under federal law, you don't have to actually touch anything. You're still going to be as guilty as the person who did. And
so in other words, the prosecutor didn't have to come up with all of these counts.
Oh, absolutely.
No.
That's a great point. I mean, I am so, not to minimize what happened, but I am so impressed with the depth of work that was put into this case. And as John has said, this is a template now for any other future terrorists in this country that want to try to do something like that. Think again, because you're going down.
Interesting question, because earlier we were talking about who the heck would come to the defense of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and give any kind of a statement, maybe some sort of psychiatrist. But Brian, how does the prosecutor at this point in time make the decision about who should come forward in the death penalty phase? Because the prosecutor had 92 witnesses. How do you make that decision?
Well, to me, it's pretty easy. I'm bringing the family members in, and I'm letting them talk about the depth of the loss of loved ones, because that's really what this case is about.
Aggravating factors are what the prosecution needs to prove.
Meaning what?
Anything that made this already heinous crime even more heinous. And then the opposite is true for the defense. They want to bring the mitigating factor. The only one that they seem to have is that, he was under the thumb of his big brother. Maybe they're going to pull something else out of their hat. We'll have to see.
I mean, realistically, I don't mean to underestimate this, but the prosecution doesn't really need to bring in a lot of evidence.
That's why I'm asking the question. So, do you take into account maybe what the message was that the jury was giving you now? But at the same time, you don't want to undersell the death penalty phase. So how do you decide that? You're not going to have 92 people, right?
No, but I think that's an excellent point, Gretchen, because a lot of what lawyers do is they oversell a case, and they bring in too much information to a jury. It's like a sporting event. You've got to read the other side, make adjustments, and you've got to read what the jury did here. They sent a resounding message in the prosecution's favor. So in my opinion, in the death penalty phase, less is better. Bring an emotion into the death penalty phase.